Senators, I rise today to speak at third reading of Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act. Bill C-45 must promote the health and safety of Canadians. It must be based on facts, evidence, and research findings. Many issues were raised during the time we had to analyze the bill. In its original form, C-45 was far from perfect, as demonstrated by the 44-plus amendments, including the 29 technical ones that have so far been adopted. We have progressed. I wish to recognize the diligent work of the Standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology for the scrutiny of Bill C-45 and the complementary work done by the other committee which studied the bill. I also want to thank the sponsor, Senator Dean, for his work in shepherding C-45 through the Senate. We are in the last day of our review of the bill. Today, the theme of discussion is public health, consumption, and indigenous issues. I will make remarks with regard to risk exposure of vulnerable populations, namely young people and First Nation and Aboriginal people. The existing regime of prohibition and criminalization of cannabis used for recreational purposes presents a high level of risk for youth, criminality, organized crime, health risk. The regime proposed in Bill C-45 moved recreational cannabis to a legalized substance widely available under some controls. The new regime creates a profit-seeking industry. Companies are champing at the bite to sell cannabis on the illicit market. The jump from total prohibition to legalization and the creation of a new commercial sector, including the creation of a cannabis lobby that we can reasonably expect will push to loosen regulations, will present challenges in implementation, public education, and enforcement. According to police experts and officials speaking to their experience in other jurisdictions where cannabis has been decriminalized or legalized, the new regime poses equally high risk. To say that, once legalized, the societally and health problems related to cannabis use will be solved is to ignore what we heard during the study of C-45. I cannot hide, and I am apprehensive of this major shift, which will happen without a logical stepwise transition. My instinct is to proceed cautiously and to make every effort to reduce risk to vulnerable populations. I still believe that decriminalization and limited sales points where strictly controlled cannabis products are available would have been a better way to achieve government objective of reducing harm and risk associated with cannabis use and abuse. To ensure that fewer young people use cannabis, it is vital that profit-seeking corporations are prevented from advertisement and promotion that appeal to youth, and as with alcohol and tobacco. In my mind, we should logically expect companies to aim to increase consumption of the substance they are selling to the public. Legalization and the availability of cannabis on the illicit market will very likely increase consumption of cannabis, at least for an initial period. To claim the contrary is dishonest. And if the taxes collected from cannabis sales will pay for infrastructure, controls, education, and health programs, scientific research, then a lot of cannabis will have to be sold and consumed. However, adults will also be allowed to cultivate and produce their own cannabis, and by my evaluations, the number doesn't add that well. I have yet to see a realistic estimate of the cost versus revenue, nor estimate of how much cannabis will have to be sold per capita to pay for the legalized regime and still beat organized crime. First Nations and Aboriginal communities will face greater risk from cannabis legalization. They already struggle with problems such as alcohol, drug abuse, and high suicidal rate. To ignore these facts is irresponsible. Some communities want the possibility of an opt-in, opt-out system where they can decide whether to ban or allow cannabis. Some communities wish to claim excise tax and revenues to fund education and social awareness programs. Surely, the tax revenue will be proportional to the sales and therefore proportional to consumption. To me, this is like a spinning in circles. In the last decades, hundreds of medical and psychological studies have been conducted revealing the effects and negative impacts of cannabis use on the developing brain. Besides short-term impairment, cannabis may affect cognition in the longer term via various brain mechanisms and at a various degree of irreversibility if cannabis use is stopped. Cannabis use may affect brain function in young people, handicapping planning, reasoning, inhibitory process, self-monitoring, and problem-solving. Medical research has found that these effects may be linked with potency, frequency, and mode of intake of cannabis compound. Recent research has found relationship between cannabis use and psychosis events. We must monitor these effects to fully understand the effects of cannabis on the developing brain. Thus, I'm strongly supportive of the observation made by the committee urging that the federal government to fund an ongoing research initiative on the impacts of cannabis use on the developing brain. By collecting data on the demographic of which age group are using cannabis, on what form of cannabis and how it is ingested, and on the potency of the cannabis use, scientists and public health officials will hopefully be able to assess by the unbiased scientific methods the effect of cannabis use on Canadians. A high percentage of young Canadians are already using cannabis, and a majority of senators seem sure that C-45 will reduce these sad statistics. I really hope so. I will never get tired of repeating that young people are our intellectual and social capital, and we must protect them. Otherwise, we fail as a society. I share concerns raised by my colleagues about making cannabis widely available to Aboriginal youth and support recommendations made by the Aboriginal Peoples Committee to ensure the development of educational programs and materials, as well as funding for mental health and addiction programs that are culturally adapted to their specific needs. Canadians have a right to a smoke-free environment, whether it is from tobacco or cannabis, as smoking can lead to serious health problems. It's vital to monitor the use of cannabis in school and safety-sensitive workplaces. While I am not completely satisfied that the issues raised by C-45 were addressed through amendments, it is in my view that the amendments, as well as the observations and recommendations raised at committee and in this chamber, have strengthened the bill. Bill C-45, with this amendment, it looks more robust than its initial form. I'm looking forward to hearing back from the government and learning that they took into consideration the observations and the recommendations made by the Senate. The government must focus on continuing education vulnerable populations about the risk of using cannabis. With these considerations in mind, I will vote in favor of the motion for third reading of Bill C-45. Senators, by this time next year, I will be asking about the outcomes of C-45. What were the results and challenges of implementation of cannabis legalization? I will demand government accountability in this if these legislations fail to attain the desired public health outcomes. Thank you.
On debate on the main motion, Senatrice Meiji.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise today to join my voice with those of other colleagues in this House on Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act. I would like to begin by quoting the motto attributed to Dr. Ambroise Paré, the father of modern surgery: cure sometimes, relieve often, comfort always. Now, I'm going to insert this motto into this evening's debate. Now, allow me to explain. Cure sometimes. When it comes to curing an illness, the word sometimes highlights the humility needed to practice medicine. Physicians must accept that they cannot make a difference for some of their patients. They cannot save their lives. The same is true for parliamentarians. Unfortunately, the existing cannabis legislation has not managed to maintain the health of our fellow citizens. With this bill, will this bill rather let us work miracles? I doubt it. However, let's save what we can while we still have time. It is clear that a total ban among teenagers is unrealistic. We need a harm reduction strategy that takes into account the quality and integrity of the lives of the people concerned. We need to tread carefully and find the right balance between the social harm experienced by offenders and the adverse effects of early cannabis use on young people's cognitive development. Relieve often. When legalizing a potentially dangerous substance, we must consider harm reduction. We know how marijuana affects the brain, the risks of psychoses, schizophrenia, paranoid delusions and hallucinations, and so on and so forth. Harm reduction measures such as plain packaging will ensure that any legalized product will be controlled from production to consumption. Whether it's through the legislation or regulations, we must ensure that there is plain packaging, proper labeling, and relevant warnings on the packaging. That will help the government provide a framework for the enforcement of cannabis use. This approach is essential and will help to delay the age of introduction to cannabis use and support informed, responsible, and safe consumer choices. Comfort always. Honourable Senators, I would like to focus on the third part of this motto. The word comfort usually means to care for someone in order to provide assistance to relieve physical affliction. To that end, I would like to stress a few key issues in this regard. In this current debate, one of the only areas of consensus is around prevention. Serious efforts must be made so that young people are made aware of the dangers of cannabis as they are for tobacco. Parents also need reliable options to protect their children from the damaging impacts of cannabis. This work must be done in cooperation with educators, healthcare professionals, youth centres and community agencies. Additional resources must be allocated to help people deal with the mental health problems underlying their cannabis use. Now, public health and safety are everybody's concern, whether Bill C-45 passes or not. We must encourage educational outreach at every level, and we need a long-term plan with ongoing and sustained activities. One thing is clear, cannabis regulation requires a comprehensive strategy with all the components I've just discussed. A responsible policy must take into account that we are legislating a substance that has been prohibited for almost a century, and we now have to develop the proper education programs we can obtain at that stage reliable data by conducting rigorous studies on the effects of cannabis and on consumption patterns. And I'm sure that there will be indicators that we'll be able to develop so that we can have tailored interventions for targeted clientele. And that is the manner in which we will ensure accountability. And it's on this note, Honourable Senators, that I point out that these are the public health issues we must consider when we vote on Bill C-45 tomorrow, and moreover, after the vote is taken. Thank you.
Senator Belmar.
Senator Belmar. I move that the debate be deferred to the next sitting of the Senate. Is it the pleasure of honourable senators to adopt the motion? Carried.
Numéro 3, C-46.
Number 3, C-46, deferred. Bill, second reading.
1, C-48.
Stand.
Numéro 2, C-55.
Number 2, C-55, stand.
8.
Are senators ready for a question? It was moved by the Honourable Senator Ringett, seconded by the Honourable Senator Cools, that Bill C-58 be read a second time. It's your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion. Adopted. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
When shall this be read a third time, Senator Ringett?
Honourable Senators, I reluctantly move that the bill be referred to the Standing Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs.
Senator Bovey, that the bill be referred to the Standing Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs. Is it your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion? Adopted. Carried.